I'm Bob Short, and this is Reflections on Georgia Politics, sponsored by Young Harris College and the Richard B. Russell Library at the University of Georgia. Our guest today is State Representative Harry Geisinger. Welcome, Harry.
Thank you, Bob, for having me.
With your permission, Harry, we would like to sort of divide our conversation into two or three parts. First of all, your early life, and then your interest in running for public office, and finally that second career you started about 6 or 8 years ago when you ran for a second career in state government. So before we get to your political career, let's talk a little bit about your early life.
Well, I was I was born in the Yankee. I was born in Cincinnati, Ohio, and spent my earlier years. We moved to Chicago in 1941, just before the war broke out. And so I lived up there all through my formative years and went to high school there and then went off to college. And when after my first year of college, they were still drafting in those days, as you recall. And I was concerned because some of my friends had been drafted into the Army. And the last thing I wanted to do was to go into the Army, even though I was in college. So I went ahead, having a deferment, which looking back on it now is sort of crazy. I went ahead and enlisted in the Navy. And I spent my next 4 years in navigation and traveled the world. It turned out to be one of the best things I ever did because I had a 17,000-ton yacht, the USS Roanoke, and we showed the flag. So I made 2 trips to the Mediterranean of 6 months each. And then we were deployed over into the Korean War broke out, and it was at the time that just before I went in. So we were deployed to the Pacific. So I spent 8 months over in the Pacific and did get to Incheon, where one of our Georgians became a famous individual, Howard Bo Calloway, who was, I think at the time, a young lieutenant, or stormed the beaches of Incheon and set the beachhead up, and you can go in history and read all about all that. But then, came back, and after the service, I went back to college and finished up at, I first finished at Lincoln College and then went on to the University of Cincinnati. And then came south because this is where the business was at the time, or at least I was working with my father's consulting firm. And we felt that it was a good area to open up and that Atlanta was the place to be. But what I found when I got down here was that the businesses at that time, which were basically the textile mills and most of the businesses, were family businesses. And the owners were basically older, and the bottom line is that they were either going to shut it down, or the money from Texas was coming into Georgia. And they came in and made total changes. So I didn't stay in that business forever. I finally got out of it, and I had a wife and a daughter to feed, so I went into the radio business and worked at WGST for a few years, and then went on to WKLS. About the time that I went into politics, I was over at WKLS, and at the same time, I started my own advertising agency. Mm-hmm. And but
how did you get interested in politics?
Well, I had a father that really was a very strong conservative individual, and I was sort of weaned on what FDR had done and Harry Truman and where we were as a nation. And so I sort of gravitated. I came to Georgia as a Republican. I've always been a Republican. I think by comparison to some of the Republicans we have, I may be a little bit more moderate than they are, but not that much. I'm not rabid about it because I know that for for us to work as a party legislatively, we've got to work with the Democrats, whether they're conservative Democrats or liberal Democrats. And that's what I've done over the years.
Tell us about your first campaign.
Interesting campaign. First, the way I got involved is that I was a precinct leader out in Dorrville. I built a house out there and got involved in, if you remember, Roscoe Pickett running against Mr. Davis, I believe it was, the congressman at the time, who represented Atlanta and DeKalb. James C. Davis?
James C. Davis. Judge Davis.
Judge Davis. And yeah, those were sort of funny times because Roscoe had enough money to go ahead and buy a half hour. And he would get on television, and of course everything was live. And he would get on television, and I can vividly remember the day that he was there trying to explain to people where they lived. By that, he wanted to make sure that people that lived in the 4th District knew they were in the 4th District, and had this big map and went through this big description of the 4th District. And needless to say, Judge Davis won, but when Judge Davis retired, Jimmy Mackey was the congressman, and that's when I got involved in this was after the Goldwater campaign, which was '64. In '66, Ben Blackburn chose to run against Jimmy Mackey. And Jimmy had he had a ACA rating, which was the rating. You had an ADA and ACA. He had an ACA rating, a conservative rating of 0, and a liberal rating of 100. And what's so interesting is because in those days I had been detailing doctors for 5 years. And in those days, what happened was the doctors were most upset because they were worried about socialized medicine. I mean, when you think about how far back all this goes and how much concern they had at the time about the government coming in and telling you how to run, and they said it was going to happen if we don't, get the right people elected. So they got behind Ben Blackburn. And I managed that campaign. I quit my job with Neisler Laboratories, which was a subsidiary of Union Carbide. And I managed his campaign. I'd never done it before. And his only condition was that I manage it since he's going to run, because he had said 3 times to the AJC, no, I'm not going to run. And so I put together one day over lunch with him. In those days, we used to eat downtown. Everything was downtown. And I put together a scenario with him. I said, well, look, you're a man that could win Congress. Let me give you a scenario. How much money would you need in the bank for you to say, yes, I'll run? And he said, $40,000. This is for the United States Congress. Today, that, my first House district was $52,000, but in those days, $40,000 you could run in a big district. So I went back to the doctors that day and said, hey, you have a candidate. You just have to raise $40,000, and that's how he got started. But he was good. He had run for the State House and lost, and he turned out to be an excellent congressman. He stayed there for, I believe, 10 years, and then left. But it's, that district over the years has changed greatly because in those days it really turned to be a Republican conservative district after the Goldwater years.
Let's talk about the Goldwater year for a minute. 1964, Senator Goldwater was defeated by President Johnson, but that's the year that Bo Calloway was elected to the Congress, the first one in 137 years.
Mm-hmm.
Don't you think that was really the turning point in the growth of the Republican Party in Georgia?
Well, I do, yes, I think Barry Goldwater was the standard bearer for us. He did get Georgians to understand they could vote for a Republican. You've got to remember, Barry Goldwater only carried 6 states, and Georgia was one of them. And he was an excellent candidate. He would have made a great president. And as you say, Howard Bo Calloway won that election and served, if I recall, just 1 term, and then came home to run for governor. And of course, you know, we were all involved in this politics, trying to make things happen. And of course, one of the problems that we had, as you can appreciate, was that we would have a difficult time, in most cases, winning statewide, even though Barry Goldwater had won in '64. But Bo Calloway got the most votes.
He did.
And unfortunately, Ellis Arnold was a write-in candidate. And I want to say he had 6,000, but I think I recently read it was 36,000 votes. Is that right?
Yes, but, you know, somewhere in that vicinity.
Yeah.
Enough to
Well, to keep Bo from having 50% plus 1 vote.
right.
And that was the unfortunate part. What's interesting, we were talking about Elliot Levitas a minute ago. He was in the House at the time, and when the Georgia House made the decision as to who was going to be the next governor, Elliot voted for Howard Bo Calloway, and his explanation was, is my people in my district voted for Bo Calloway, I'm going to vote for Bo Calloway. And I think if many of the members had done that, Bo probably would have been governor, and things would have been much different for the Republicans much earlier than they are today.
Well, you took your seat, and that
60.
was after the first reapportionment, was it not?
Yes.
And
It was after the one man, one vote, too.
right.
Yeah.
And so it did away with the county unit system.
Right.
Which totally really brought Georgia politics into a modern era,
Yes.
the one man, one vote. So you go to the legislature. What was your legislative agenda?
Well, it's interesting when you look back on it, because we talked about many times problems that people were having back home. And one of the things that we did as Republicans, because we ran as a group in DeKalb County, we would go and do coffees in people's homes, and of course all the candidates would be there. Well, one of the things that we learned early on is that we were boring people to death. We couldn't get some of our candidates to talk for 2 minutes. They'd talk for 20 minutes, and we wanted to get up and leave. So what we finally did is we started something that's still in existence today, which I think is interesting. We had, at the time, running Bob Gould and Jim Geisinger and Stan Collins and George W. Smith and a few others. And we would go and have a Saturday morning breakfast. And we would sit, and we would only allow each member to have one subject that they would talk about. And that way, what we did is we made it pleasant for the people that had to sit and listen, but it made pleasant for us because, one, we weren't there. I mean, it's just amazing when you're passionate about something, you find yourself talking about it incessantly. And we had all these incessantly inspired candidates that wanted to talk about their subject. So what we did is we isolated all the subjects. Some talked about transportation problems, some talked about sewage problems. Now, you say, well, sewage, that's a local issue. It is, but as we know with the water issue today in Georgia, without water, the sewage doesn't go very far. But they were very basic. And if you recall, and I don't remember the first year that the MARTA issue came to the forefront, but I think it was before that period. And the other issue that we had is they were trying to put a property tax on homeowners to pay for MARTA. And the Republicans in DeKalb County killed it. I mean, we were against it. Not that we were against MARTA, we were against the funding method, because what you were doing is having people funding it that weren't necessarily going to use it. So then when we did that, we went ahead and moved to the sales tax when they came back with it 2 years later. But they did call all of us in that were against it and said, you know, you keep talking about sales tax, will you support it? And we said, sure. You do it with the sales tax and we'll support it. So it did pass into Cobb County when they brought it back, and it passed in Fulton County, but it didn't pass in the other 3 counties. And of course at that time, the reason it didn't pass in Cobb County was because of segregation. And if you recall, I think they created the city of Colonial Hills or something, 1 foot citywide along the Chattahoochee River that said you can't cross this with your MARTA system or something. It was
That proved to be a detriment to MARTA, didn't it?
well, it proved to be a detriment to the whole region because no one had the foresight to see that you know, we were going to be this big. I mean, what have we got now? About 5.5, 6 million people here in the metro area. So MARTA went 44 miles, and if you go back and look at the original legislation, that's what it called for, was 44 miles. That's all it's got today, 44 miles. And, you know, for us to grow, transportation is going to be critical, but we've got to think outside the box. We've got to think bigger than we think we can think, and we've got to be realistic about how we're going to raise the funds to make it happen. But this recession that we're in is not going to end tomorrow. We've got budgets coming up this coming year, and we're going to have to find and cut out of the budget another projected budget, another $1 to $2 billion. Now, the Constitution of Georgia says very clearly that you must pass a balanced budget. You cannot run a deficit. That doesn't mean that we can't bond, and we do bonding for projects, but we cannot have a budget that's out of balance. So a lot of things have happened, and you know, they furloughed everybody in government, including the legislators. Now, it's interesting, the legislators, they couldn't furlough. What they did is ask us to voluntarily say, yes, you can go ahead and we'd be willing to have you take that 1-day furlough a month out of our salary. Another thing, when you think about the salaries over the years, when I first was elected, we were paid $4,200. That was 40 years ago. Today it's $16,500, and how the young families make it is beyond me, because this year we were in session 4 months. The procedure, as you know, is 40 days, but you're only counting days that you're in session. You're not counting committee days. You're not counting weekends. You're just counting the 40 days. And if you go back, you were talking about the one man, one vote in those early days. That changed a lot of things. But the Georgia House in those days was 205 members. And in my first year, we reduced it after the reapportionment. We reduced it to 180 under George L. Smith, who to me was Mr. Speaker. And what's important about George L. is that when Lester Maddox was elected governor, and you know because you were there in these days, when Lester Maddox was elected governor, in the old days, prior to Lester, the governor selected who the speaker was. There's no question, you know, it was a matter of who's close to the governor. That wasn't what happened after the members elected their own speaker, and George L. was the speaker. And he was a great man because he didn't care about Democrats and Republicans. Now, admittedly, we weren't a threat numerically, but that wasn't the point. He had these members that he put us to work. He had me running the intern program, that is the college intern program, the second and third year of its existence. And that was just after I was elected whip. I take it back. The second year I'd been elected whip, which would have been my third year there. And I said, after the first year, I said, Mr. Speaker, I said, I can't do this. I'm the whip. I've got other things to do. Well, in retrospect, that's sort of a joke because I only had 24 people to whip into line, and I didn't need deputy whips. I did it all myself. And it wasn't that difficult because it's not like today when we have 105 members and the whip has deputies, and the deputy will check to see how the vote is going. Most people don't realize that many times a bill is not brought up simply because you've counted the noses and you know that even in your own caucus you don't have enough votes to get it passed. And it is critical, whipping the vote, to see, in fact, how many people do we have that believe in this and would be willing to vote for it. This is either before or after you've tried to convince them. But once you get it out of committee and on the floor, you don't want it to go down in flames, which they do from time to time.
The Voters' Rights Act has had an impact on politics in Georgia. How do you think that's affected the people?
Well, if you recall, because you were there at that time, we had, it's changed the structure today. But in those days, we only had 2 ladies in the House. We had Mrs. Merritt, who always wanted to change the flag, and I always said to Mrs. Merritt, well, how much is it going to cost the state? I said, you tell me how much it's going to cost the state, and I'll sign it. I mean, she could never get anybody to sign the bill. And we had Grace Hamilton, and Grace was from Atlanta, and she was the ladies' lady. I mean, she was a wonderful lady. And from that time on, it changed. We ended up getting more and more female members, and today I think we have 30, 35. The membership today is so different from when it was then. Today we have probably a dozen Hispanics. The Black Caucus is probably 35 or 40, 50. And they're not all Democrats. You know, people always say, well, if you're black, you're a Democrat. No, that's not true. African Americans understand, as well as anybody else, that what is important is the end result. So we have African Americans on both sides of the aisle.
Mm-hmm. How about the Urban Caucus?
Great group. When we first came in is when it was formed, and it was formed by the Gerald Talmadge Hortons and the Sidney Marcuses and the Red Athertons from Marietta, and it was Republican and Democrat, because it was the city boys against the country boys, and we felt that we needed every vote we could get to help the metro area survive, because, as you know, in those days, if you were, especially before the county unit system changed, the power was out there in the state. It wasn't in here. In fact, as I recall, we only were allowed, in Fulton County, was only allowed 3 members with its population. Mm-hmm. And even the smallest county in Georgia at the time, with about 3,000 people, had 1 member. Mm-hmm. And he took all those little counties of 1 and 2 members. I think only DeKalb and Fulton and Chatham and Macon, I forgot the county, Bibb County. I think they all had more than 1, but
DeKalb went.
It changed dramatically.
After reapportionment, DeKalb went from 3 to 15.
Yes.
And the Republican Party, your party, won 7 of those seats. that certainly was an indication of a growing
Yes.
strength of the Republican Party.
Well, and not just the strength of the Republican Party, but the strength of the population and where it was living. You know, when you go from 3 to 14, 15. When you go from 3 to 15, that's a gigantic jump. That's fivefold.
12 votes.
That's right.
Yeah.
It made a big difference. And from that point on, things began to move in the right direction. And of course, George L. was guiding, the speaker, George L. Smith, was guiding us through those years and did a marvelous job. And as unfortunately, he died in office.
And was succeeded by Tom Murphy.
By Tom Murphy, who had, when George L. was first elected speaker, Maddox Hale was the speaker. I mean, the speaker pro tem. Maddox died in office. And the floor leader for the governor, for Lester Maddox, was Tom Murphy. Tom Murphy became speaker pro tem. When George L. died, then Tom Murphy moved up to speaker and was there for 33, 32 years, whatever.
Long time.
Long time.
The,
Longest serving speaker in the United States.
you served with George Busby.
Yes, I did.
It's often been said that George Busby turned down an opportunity to be speaker to run for governor. Is that true?
Well, you got to remember George was on the other side of the aisle, and I don't know whether that's true or not. But what's interesting, and I've got some funny stories about George, as you know, that year I left the House in '74, and I ran for governor as a Republican. In fact, there were 5 of us in the Republican primary, and needless to say, no, I wasn't the nominee. But George and I were the only 2, and there were 11 Democrats running that year. George and I were the only 2 that were currently in the House when we chose to run for governor. And in that race on his side of the aisle was Burt Lance and Lester Maddox and Harry Jackson from Columbus.
Bobby Rowan.
Bobby, yes, how can I forget Bobby? Bless his heart, great guy. Bobby Rowan and others. And but I think of all the people that ran that year, George Busby was the most qualified. He really was. He was capable. He understood. But when in the primary period, what they would do is set us up alphabetically, Republicans and Democrats. They'd mix us all up at these debates. And I always had Harry Jackson sitting next to me. And what I would do is, you know, there was no way for me to attack George, and there was no reason for me to attack George. But I found a kindred soul in doing the attacking for me in Harry Jackson. So what I would do sitting next to Harry is I would write notes with questions on them and say, ask George, and then fold it over and slide it over to him. Well, he did that on 2 occasions. And it would get him on the front page because I'd have him ask a question, you know, that would just. And we were in Macon on Law Day at Mercer University, and I did it again. And he pushed it back. And I said, what are you doing? And he says, oh, my staff tells me not to read your notes. You get me in trouble. And I said, no, I get you on the front page. So the interesting part is that when I walked out, and of course Busby's all the way down at the end, he's B. And when I walked out, George was just in the back behind the stage just screaming at me, you know, what are you doing? And I said, George, I'm not doing anything, you know. I know what you're up to. But he was, without a doubt, the most qualified, and I'm pleased that he did get elected because he did a wonderful job over those 8 years. And one of the problems that we tend to have, even more today than we did in those days, is it wasn't necessarily the most qualified today that gets elected. It's the one that can raise the money, get on television, and convince the people who are having other things to do, whether it's playing golf or, you know, taking the kids to soccer practice or whatever, that can't take the time or don't have the time to focus on the issues and the candidates. And then because they saw somebody on television or whatever, they vote for them. And sometimes we don't always get the best. But the system still allows us to survive, but we don't always end up with the most qualified.
So you left the House. You didn't quite make it to the governor's office. What happened then?
Well, I had a debt that, and you got to keep in mind in those days, Republicans didn't have any money. I barely raised money during the campaign, but I had borrowed money. And it took me 19 years to pay that debt off. And it ended up as a second mortgage on my house. But I got it all paid off and took care of it. But if you remember, those were the Carter years, and I was turning that debt every 90 days for a while. And that's when the interest rate went to 22%. And, you go talk to a bank about, I need to borrow money on this debt or roll it. And I finally said, this is crazy. So.
Did you go back to your career in radio?
Yes and no. What I did is I spent more time in the advertising of my ad agency, which I had developed while I was in the House. And at the same time, I opened 2 more businesses. I went into the coal brokerage business for 5 years, and went up all through the coal regions and contracting for coal, and sold coal, which you had to bid on. I mean, it wasn't, and sold coal. And then I also opened a consumer buying service up in Tennessee, and so I was keeping 3 businesses going at one time.
Until 1980.
Yes. Then in 1980, of course, what happened is I had been involved in the Mattingly campaign, and Ronald Reagan was elected, and they asked me if I wanted to be administrator of Southeastern Power, and I said sure. So I did that for 8 years, and it was in fact, the cheapest power the TVA bought. They bought it from us. But it was the 22 hydro facilities east of the Mississippi. And it was an exciting time.
Did that include Tennessee Valley Authority?
No, but we supplied the TVA with power. Up there on the Cumberland River, there are 8 projects that were part of the Southeastern Power administrations. In fact, recently there was a bad flood up there, and a lot of that would have been worse had those dams not been there, but it was horrendous. I happened to be up there on business at the time, and couldn't believe the Grand Ole Opry Hotel flooded out. I don't know whether have you been there with all the gardens and everything?
Yes.
Frightening.
Yeah.
But nobody complained. Those folks all pulled together and made things work.
Let's talk about that 1980 senatorial election. Senator Talmadge was in the race and was eventually defeated, but there was a gangbusters Democratic primary between Talmadge and Zell Miller and Norman Underwood and Dawson Mathis, Congressman Mathis, and others. What do you remember about all that?
Well, of course, I was involved on the Mattingly side. And by then, because, we tend to make little niches of specialties in life, I had taken on ballot security. And the particular day of the election, one of our Republicans and I went to South Fulton and we covered about 38, 40 precincts. And what we would do is we would go around and let them know who we were, that we were ballot security people. In fact, in the early hours, what we'd do is take some boxes of donuts with us and leave them with them. But they knew that we would be coming back, and then we'd split it up in half and go our own way through the late morning and the rest until they closed the boxes that evening. What was interesting about that is I had a school, and this was important because we were concerned about how the vote was going to go, and there was a school in South Fulton that we had been to, and we always made a note of how many people had voted. And I went back there about 2.5 hours later, and walking through the school, there were no voters, nobody. In fact, I asked the principal, I said, how's it been? How's the traffic been? He says, I don't think there's ever been anybody in here lately. And yet, when I checked the numbers, there were about 280 people that had voted while I was gone. So, what I found out later, yes, they had stolen them. What they were doing is having the employees that were working the precinct go, and they knew who wasn't going to show up. And they would go and vote those people and fill out the forms and go through all of it. So nothing happened to those folks. And when I found out later was that they had actually were really concerned about a local race more than they were about the Mattingly race. They couldn't care less about the Mattingly race. They were fighting among themselves, but they were stealing. They stole about 280 votes. And we have caught them over the years doing that. They even did that during Paul Coverdale's race. They bussed students from some of the local colleges downtown in and paid them to go in there and vote. They arrived about 10 minutes before the poll was to close. And our poll watcher, who had left about an hour earlier, wasn't there. And when you look at the numbers, because Paul, I think, only got, in that election, he only got 6 or 8 votes in that precinct. And then in the runoff, he got 4, but his opponent, got a 10th of what he had gotten before. So, because we had it covered, most people don't want to steal, and most people don't. It's the politicals, the power brokers that think that, we can steal this election. It's extremely difficult today to do that. But in those days, it wasn't that difficult.
So you think our modern elections are secure?
Well, yes and no. They're electronic, as we know. You can't steal like you could before, although you could probably let somebody vote that shouldn't if you don't keep the records correct. But one of my concerns, you remember the old votomatics that we had for years, which was nothing more than a punch card?
Yeah.
My concern about the votomatic is that they would always, the operator would put, well, first they would run a test program, and there would be somebody from the two parties there who knew about computers or determining the elections. And they would run a test, and it would say yes, and then at the end they'd run the test. They never, and I tried for years to get them to stop the election in the middle and run the test again, unannounced. And of course, nobody wanted to do that because the last thing they wanted was to slow down the process. It was slow enough as it was, but they didn't want to slow it down anymore. And when you realize that the attendant to the machines and the ballots put a header card in there to identify the precinct on the printout, he could just as easily put a card in there that says, you get every third of my votes, you get one of them, or fifth, or whatever you decide is the number. And, we've never proved that because no one would ever stop and do it. But the electronic is probably as secure. My concern is that if you're going to have a question in the electronic, we don't have a ballot. We don't have anything in paper to go back and actually look at. So the paper ballot, and some counties have used it over the years, is about the size of a bed sheet, and you run it into this scanner but the ballot falls into the bottom. And all you have to do then, if there's some question, is pull them out and physically count them. And you can do that, or count them through the machine or through another machine.
What is your opinion of the voter ID law?
Well, I think it's important that we do that, because we shouldn't have people who are not eligible to vote voting. The law makes it very, very clear who is eligible and who is not. And voter ID just clarifies that. You know, when we went to motor voter, which was nothing more than when you went to get your driver's license renewed or initially, they automatically registered you to vote. Well, we've got a lot of illegal people on the rolls that are voting that shouldn't be. And we have to tighten that up. But it's in the, in most cases the laws are there. It's in the physical operation that we haven't justified it.
So in 2004,
Yes.
you came back to the legislature. How had it changed?
Good question. Physically, the chamber hadn't changed, except where we used to have ashtrays, we now had plugs for our computers. Yeah. The voting system, when I left before, was an electronic system that George L. Smith had installed. And what's interesting about that is that basically none of it had changed. The chairs we're sitting in today are over 100 years old. Physically, they've tried to keep the appearance. Physically, the chamber, if you recall, the fireplaces were covered up. I don't know who did that, but that was before my time. And I believe Tom Murphy, when they reworked it, they uncovered the fireplaces. And in the old days, I am told, those were prime seats, because in the wintertime, you wanted to be close to the fire, and because that building had to be cold and drafty. Today it's cold, but it's because the air conditioning is working well, and when you go in there the first thing in the morning, it is, I don't care what it is outside, it's really cold inside.